So the biggest potential for South Africa's growth over the coming months and years is in its young population, a young population demanding change, wanting different policies and ideas.
Welcome to another IATP Explainer. This week we are joined by Chris Hattingh. Chris is the head of policy analysis at the Center for Risk Analysis. He is also a senior fellow at African Liberty and a member of the IATP's Advisory Council. Much of Chris's work is focused on trade and economic policy in South Africa. What is the state of inflation in South Africa?
Well, at this point in time, on the surface, things are looking pretty good. Inflation has declined to a 13-month low as of May this year. Consumer price inflation in South Africa was at 6.3%, down from 6.8% in April. So the trend over the last 2 months has been downward, if even only slightly. But I do think if one peeks below the hood, as it were, you look at the main drivers of inflation, which in my view point to government policies that exacerbate business operation costs, that make the movement of goods and services more difficult. All of those obviously increase business operation costs. You also have very high fuel taxes as part of the fuel levy that is charged in South Africa. All of these things increase the costs that businesses have to deal with, and they eventually pass these on to consumers. The Reserve Bank, for its part, has done well to impose fiscal stability, fiscal responsibility, hiking interest rates even before the US Federal Reserve, for example, started its hiking cycle. But the Reserve Bank can only do so much in the bigger picture as regards the fight against inflation.
What has the South African government done to make inflation worse?
So this problem has been percolating, as it were, for many years now, arguably over the last 10 to 15 years. If you look at the monopolies, the government monopolies in electricity and transport specifically, so in electricity, Eskom, and in transport, Transnet, in both of those areas, the state service delivery has declined almost disastrously over the last 2 to 3 years. We've got rolling blackouts at very high stages of intensity. And also with your railways, you've got the decline of capabilities, but also just of general safety on the part of Transnet. So, for example, companies move goods into the country through ports, which generally rank quite low on the container port performance index. So the goods take a long time to move through the ports. And then once they get onto railway, where there is still railway networks, it also takes a very long time. That means that businesses have to rely more and more on road transport. And when fuel costs increase, that of course increases the cost of road transport. And in turn, the roads experience more pressure, which leads to higher costs in terms of maintenance. So on the one hand, you've got issues in the transport area as a result of government policy, and then also in electricity, where businesses have to spend more money on generators and fuel to run generators. So in those two specific areas, government policy, in keeping their protected monopolies in place, has exacerbated costs across the board and keeps inflation much higher than it ordinarily should be. And then for the consumers, it increases costs across the board, where businesses are forced to deal with these costs and they have to factor those into their daily operations, and consumers then have to deal with that. So in the context of an over 40% unemployment rate, people's money does not go nearly as far as it used to. What money they do have is also now being eaten away by persistently stubborn inflation, kept high by the wrong sorts of government policies and ideas.
How severe are South Africa's rolling blackouts, and why are they happening?
So as of the last month, blackouts have been relatively less intense, just in terms of the period of outages. So at the moment, South Africans on average experience about 2.5 hours of outages per day, whereas in previous months it might have been up to 8 hours at given points. The main cause of this, or the cause of this, is Eskom, the government monopoly in electricity. The government-owned company is unable to meet demand, the result of years of a lack of maintenance, but also because of corruption, because of state capture. So if you have a government monopoly and the wrong sorts of policies in place, you increase the possibilities that things can go wrong. And when they do go wrong, the whole economy suffers as a result. Because of the last month of relatively less load shedding, some of the country's prospects are looking a little bit better in terms of economic growth. Maybe we might hit the 1% mark this year if we're lucky. I still don't think that is likely. But for the time being, Eskom seems to be getting some of its issues, right? Especially if you look at the issue of maintenance, and there may be a focus now on really drilling down on maintenance, making sure that the right equipment and parts are being procured. But that's going to take a long time to turn around a lot of its issues at its coal-fired power stations, the main stations of Kusile and Medupi, years over budget. Parts of the sections of those power stations still not operating, even past the deadlines that are now years past. So all of this feeds into the pressures on Eskom. And of course, if you don't have reliable, cheap electricity, you can't really have a growing economy. One of the ways for South African businesses they are trying to mitigate this is a shift to more renewable energy, solar panels, going off grid as much as they can afford. So in that way, there's big opportunities for investment in renewable energy, but you still run into issues around bureaucracy and licensing requirements from the government side. So the sort of pipeline of renewable energy is massive in South Africa, but then you've got transmission constraints and also license constraints. So at the moment, businesses are trying to do the best they can. Eskom seeming to have a handle on some of its issues, but the prospects for the time being remain that we're going to have to deal with load shedding for the time being.
South Africa is having an election next year. How likely is it that the ANC wins? And are there any parties in South Africa that are friendly to free markets?
As we have this discussion, it looks like the ANC will still win the largest share of the vote, but it is highly likely that the party will attain below 50% for the first time in a national election. Now, partly a result of its own failures and voters' frustrations with the ANC, and also the growing popularity in some avenues, some paths, as it were, of opposition parties like the Democratic Alliance, the Economic Freedom Fighters, Action SA, the Freedom Front Plus, the ACDP, to name a few others. It looks like South Africa's future is going to be coalition government and coalition governance. There have been some examples of this on the municipal and metro level, places like Johannesburg and Tshwane in Pretoria. Those municipalities have struggled with those coalition agreements. Johannesburg, for example, could possibly have its fourth mayor within 12 months if things go in the direction that they have been in the last few weeks. So maybe those don't give voters the most confidence in coalition agreements, but it looks like, in general, the South African democracy is heading into an era of coalition government, and we'll see how exactly that shakes out in terms of the sort of minute details. In terms of free market policies, the Democratic Alliance, the sort of most classically liberal, as it were, with the history of liberalism behind it, with opposition to apartheid and coming out of apartheid from various organizations that came together and that formed the Democratic Alliance over time. But also, if you look at parties like Action SA, also the Inkatha Freedom Party, there are notes of free market policies of respect for the rule of law, for individual agency, and for economic freedom. In terms of policy proposals, the DAs would be the most robust, as it were, and the most researched, while the other parties also provide some commentary here and there. So those particular parties, if they can work together in various ways, maybe focus on certain priorities, should they come into a coalition government and work against possibly an ANC EFF coalition, maybe then we'll see reforms in different areas. And I think a lot is going to hinge on provincial performance as well, where maybe provinces and municipalities compete with each other, and those that have the better ideas and policies, as has been the case with the Western Cape, especially the last 5 years, they will become more attractive to investment and to voters, and people will demand those similar sorts of policies in the places where they live.
Why are you optimistic about Africa's future?
So the biggest potential for South Africa's growth over the coming months and years is in its young population, a young population demanding change, wanting different policies and ideas, wanting to improve their quality of life, wanting businesses to flourish. If they advocate for the right ideas, take the right action in demanding change from their governments, then you will see a lot of reason for hope in the continent's future, especially given how young it is and how much it'll grow compared to other populations around the world. If governments can get some of those basics right, things like trade policy, like policies that encourage economic freedom, then you'll definitely see lots of reason for hope in Africa, and South Africa especially. In South Africa's context, things at the moment being quite depressed from the growth point of view, from the prospects point of view, but with that higher risk comes also more opportunities if we can get some of the policies and ideas right.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this video, you may find some of our other work interesting. Check out another video here. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button below, leave a comment, and follow the IATP on Twitter at @the_IATP.